It's been over 1 year since I created this video on how to build your own indoor DIY worm composting system, and it's time for an update. Hey, it's Phil from Earth Nails and Tails, and I wanted to show you just how well these worms are doing and answer the 10 most commonly asked questions about how to use this system to create your own worm castings at home. For some quick background, I've had this system going since February of 2023. And over that time, the worms have been working away, eating the coconut coir bedding and all of the food scraps that I have been putting into this worm composting system. And they've been creating amazing worm castings or worm compost, or better known as worm poop. And the reason why I created this system is because worm castings are full of beneficial nutrients and microbes that really help your garden explode with health. And you can go online or go to the store and find bags of worm castings, but to get some good quality stuff, it's gonna be pretty expensive. Or I could just make a system like this and recycle most of my fruit and veggie scraps from my kitchen or even my garden, put them in the system and make my own worm castings at home. So if you want to see exactly how I set up this system and how to keep the worms happy and creating your own worm castings, you can watch this video right here. And I'll put a link down in the description below. It's one of my most popular and best rated videos, so I highly recommend you check it out. Now, before we get into the most commonly asked questions, if you're new to the channel or you're a returning viewer, please make sure you subscribe to our channel, like this video, and turn on those notifications so that way every time we release a video, you're immediately notified in order to grow your best garden yet. The very first question that I get is, can I use worms from my garden? Can I use earthworms? Can I use night crawlers? And the answer is no. There are very specific composting worms that you want to use for a system like this, or a larger system that you're using in order to create your own worm castings. The reason being, they are very specific worms. They are composting worms. They are able to eat multiple times their weight in food scraps in order to create those worm castings, which makes it really efficient and why you want to use these worms. So the worms that I use and that you should use in your composting systems are called red wigglers. And I typically get them from Mr. Jim's, and I'll put a link in the description below. I'm not sponsored by them at all. I bought my worms for this system for the first time almost 2 years ago, and I've had the same worms working in here ever since. And they're really good at naturally maintaining their population. So based off of how much food is available in the system, they will either grow or shrink, self-regulate, so you don't really have to worry about it. As long as you're properly maintaining the system, they'll figure it all out. The second question I get asked is, the holes on the bottom of this bucket are really big. Won't the worms just fall out? So what they're talking about is actually the buckets that I put in here, these giant holes on the bottom. What these holes are for, and as you can see, there's some water dripping out already, is to allow the moisture that gets trapped in the system that's created by all of the food scraps and the worms, it allows it to drain into the bottom of the bucket because you don't want to have an overly moist system. But also, as I put this third bucket on top right here, it allows the worms to travel into the new bucket once this bucket here gets full. So I've had a lot of people recommend, oh, why don't you just put a mesh layer on the inside of this bucket so that way the worms don't fall through. But that would completely avoid the whole purpose of this system. You don't want to have any obstructions on the bottom of this bucket because then the worms won't be able to move from the bin that we have here up into the new bin. So for that reason, do not use any sort of mesh material inside of your worm composting system, because then you're going to have to manually take all of the worms out of the worm castings in the bottom bucket and put them in the new bucket for the system to work. And that's just a lot of unnecessary effort. The third question or comment that I get all the time is, you use this inside, it has to smell. And it actually doesn't at all. The only reason this system would smell is if you put rotting food inside of it. Just think, go out to your garden soil, take a scoop of it and smell your soil. It doesn't smell at all. It essentially has a neutral smell. And it's gonna be the same thing in here. Your worms are essentially creating their own soil. It's like, yeah, they're making their own poop, but they're making soil. So as long as you're not putting rotten food scraps in here, there should be absolutely no reason why it smells. If it does smell, you may be using food that is way past due, and you shouldn't be putting it in the system anyway, because you could potentially kill your worms. But what I want you to do is, if you are having some smells, I want you to really move that bedding material out of the way, put the food scraps in, and then properly cover it so you won't have to worry about that at all. This way the worms have the best access that they can have to that food, and they're gonna eat it quickly and not allow that food to actually decay inside of your system. The fourth question I get is, can I use this system outside? And the answer is yes. I've designed the system so that way you can use it indoors or out. I've seen a lot of people design systems where they put holes on top of the bin, but for me, that's an absolute no-no, because if you do leave this system outside and it rains, guess what? All of the rain is gonna go into the top of the system, and it's gonna make an extremely moist environment, and it could potentially kill your worms. So that's one reason why I put the holes all along the top of the bin here. Another thing that you have to consider is your environment. Your worms like to live in temperatures or environments like we do, a nice comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So as the temperatures get cooler, the worms are gonna slow down significantly. They're not gonna be eating as much. They're gonna kind of go into that hibernation type of state. And if it gets too warm, you could potentially kill them. So just keep these things in mind. When it's a beautiful spring or fall like it is right now, I could leave this bin outside and they'll be perfectly fine. But in the winter time, if you want to keep the system going, it's best to bring them into your kitchen and let them continue to work. And as we discussed, if you're using the system properly, there should be no reason why you wouldn't want to have this in your system unless it's just for lack of space. The fifth question is, how are the bugs? Are there any fly larvae or gnats or fruit flies in the system? And the answer is absolutely not. And the reason being is because we have these really tiny holes up top that allow air to flow through, but they're so small that the gnats and the bugs, the flies, cannot get inside the system. But another reason why the system doesn't attract any bugs is because you're burying your food scraps. The flies and all that, they're gonna be attracted to anything that's easily available to them. But if you move that bedding out of the way and you bury your food scraps in the middle of the system and bury it over, one, the flies and the gnats aren't gonna have access to it, but two, the worms should eat it relatively quickly. You shouldn't be overfeeding your system. And if you are, that's when you can have problems like bugs or even worse problems that we're gonna talk about. The sixth question that I get is, when do I add the new bin? So if you saw the first video, you know that this is a 3-bin system, and I'll give you a really quick primer on how the system functions. We have a bottom bin, which is completely solid, and this is used all to catch all of the drainage that comes out of the system. It captures all of the moisture. Then we have the first bucket right here, which is how we start the system. We load the system with bedding, we add in the worms, and then we start adding in our food scraps for them to eventually break it down and turn it into worm castings. So this is always going to be placed in the bucket like this. Now, you'll be able to start to recognize that most of this is worm castings by the color and the texture. It's gonna go from that flaky brown coconut coir to these rich, dark brown, almost ball-like looking structure. And that's all the worm castings, that's all of the worm poop. So when you see all of that start to turn to worm castings, that's the time in which you add on the third bucket. The third bucket and the second bucket are the exact same. So if I just had my second bucket on here, what I would do is take off my lid, and then I would add my third bucket right on top, which I've had going already. And now what this does is provides a new environment for the worms to travel up into. and then I'll just take my lid and place it right on top. So when I add this third bucket, I'll have to make sure that I add some bedding and some food scraps, some fresh food scraps, in order to provoke the worms to travel from that bottom bin up into the new one. The seventh question is, hey, you've had this system for almost 2 years. How long does this take? Well, it completely depends on how good you are at maintaining your system. We start by putting bedding into the system, and then we add our worms in and just let them get used to their new home. After some time, we'll start to add food scraps. What you need to do is watch how long it takes for your worms to eat all that food scraps. As soon as it's gone, put new food scraps in. So the more you observe the system, and if you stay on top of your worms and figure out what their feeding schedule is, you can make worm compost extremely quickly, anywhere from 3 to 6 months. Yeah, that might seem like a long time, but they're little worms and they have a lot of food to eat through. But if you're not focusing on replenishing the system with food, it's gonna take longer, anywhere from 9 months to a year. Oh, and don't worry if you miss a day or two between feedings, because they can eat the bedding as well. That's why we provide it to them initially. They're gonna eat that bedding material as well as all of the kitchen scraps that you put into the system. So if you miss a few days, they'll be just fine. The eighth question is, my worms keep escaping. What's happening? What am I doing wrong? And there could be a few reasons why. The first is that you may not be feeding them enough. They're hungry, they want to eat, and they want especially fresh scraps. So what I want you to do is, again, maintain your system, watch your system, keep an eye on your system. They're essentially your pets, and you should feed them properly, especially if you want them to work their best. So if you go in here and you see large chunks of food that are starting to decay, take those out. And that should be a reminder to you to provide them smaller pieces so that way it's easier for them to break down. It could also be an indication that the system is either too dry or too wet. If you have an excessive amount of moisture in your system, and that can be an indication of a lot of moisture in your bottom bucket, that means you might be just like feeding them too much at one time. Just break those feedings up to smaller and smaller feedings. You really want to minimize the overall moisture inside the system. At the end of the day, the bedding should be moist but not seeping wet. If you have moisture dripping down into this bottom bucket, slow down their feeding schedule, and that should really help. On the other end, your system might be too dry. So when you initially set up your system, you want to make sure that you're putting in a nice, moist bedding. I like to use coconut coir. So when I add my coconut coir, I make sure that it's nice and moist, and I'll wring it out so that way it's the consistency of a wrung out sponge. I'll put that in initially, let the worms settle, and then I'll slowly add in my food scraps. The ninth question is a great question. How do I use the worm castings? Yeah, that's the whole point of the system, right? Is to make your own worm castings to use them in the garden. So obviously in this system, I'm not making a ton, but it really doesn't take a lot of castings in order to see significant results out in the garden. So what I like to do is every time that I plant a new plant in my garden, I'll just put some worm castings in the bottom of the hole, just this little bit, just like a quick pinch, and put that in the bottom of the hole, plant my plant, and then I'll put a little bit more around the base of the plant. What makes worm castings so amazing? It's like fermented food. All of the food that we're adding into the system is getting eaten by the worms, digested, and pooped out. And through the digestive system, it picks up a lot of beneficial microorganisms as well. So not only are you pre-digesting the food, pre-digesting the nutrients that you're giving to your garden, which makes it more absorbable by your plants, you're also adding a ton of beneficial microbes into your garden, which are actually going to drown out the more harmful pathogens and overall make your garden more healthy. And the last question, the 10th question that I get is, how do you make worm casting tea or worm tea? And you've probably seen me get pretty emotional, pretty energetic about the liquid that we find in this system. This right here is not worm casting tea. It is not. This is essentially all of the liquid that comes from the food scraps that you put in the system, or when the worms poop, any extra moisture that's in the system is gonna drain down into the bottom here. This is not worm casting tea. The proper way to make worm tea is to take a bucket like this and take some of your worm castings that you created out of your system. And you can get a cheesecloth or a mesh bag, something that you can put the worm castings in that's perforated. You'll fill up your bucket with some nice fresh water, ideally rainwater. Stay away from chlorinated water because that's gonna kill all of the beneficial microbes that are in the worm castings. So we'll take that bag of worm castings and we'll put it in that fresh rainwater or unchlorinated water. And then we will take a bubbler like you would see in a fish tank to aerate the water, and we will let that bubbler go for at least a day. What that's going to do is create the ideal aerobic environment to distribute all of those nutrients and the beneficial microbes throughout that liquid. And then what can we do is evenly or more evenly distribute all of that amongst our garden. So if you don't have a lot of worm castings, like what we're creating in this system, this is a fantastic way for you to essentially make more from less. Well, that's gonna wrap things up for this video. And again, please make sure you subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this video, if this is gonna help you become a better worm parent, make sure you like this video as well. It means a lot and it shows YouTube that, hey, this is actually a good video, and we'll spread it out to more people so that way they can learn how to do this as well. At the end of the day, my goal is to help you become a better gardener. So if you haven't seen any of the other videos on our channel, make sure you go and check it out.